Hello, folks, and welcome to the latest episode of The Farm. This is your host, Recluse, aka Steven Snider, filling in for Frank Zero. Frank is currently gathering his strength on the astral plane for next week's show, which is going to be a Hellier extravaganza, so be sure you tune in for that one as well. Fortunately, I'm joined this week by the great Christopher Knowles. For those of you who have been living under a rock, Chris is the longtime curator of the Secret Sun such works as Our Gods Wear Spandex and The Secret History of Rock and Roll. Recently, he has published his first novel, He Will Live Up in the Sky. It's fabulous, folks, and you should do yourselves a favor and check it out ASAP if you haven't done so already. It's available on Amazon and other fine online book retailers. Now, today, we're going to tackle a subject that is very dear to my heart and maybe Chris's too. However, the rest of this planet seems to be pretty indifferent. And that's because our subject is the Great Blue Oyster Cult, which some insist there is nothing to talk about concerning. Well, we're going to try and change that perspective a bit with this podcast and hopefully give the criminally underrated band their due. Now, before we get into some of the crazy synchromystical and parapolitical stuff associated with this group, I just wanted to dwell a little bit briefly on just their grossly overlooked influence on various types of extreme, heavy, and fringe music and so on. And I should make clear at the onset, when I talk about BOC, I'm also talking about the famed producer and songwriter Sandy Pearlman, whose vision was the driving force behind much of the cult's best and most influential work. You kids probably know him from the Will Ferrell More Cowbell sketch, and that's a real pity because Pearlman was as brilliant as a diamond. And if nothing else, I'm hoping this podcast will give you listeners out there a new perspective on the man who I personally consider to be one of the great artistic visionaries of the 20th century. Sorry, Chris, did you want to add something there?
No, not at all.
All right.
I'm just listening.
Okay. All right. So, obviously, with the whole thing with Pearlman, I mean, he was just a major figure on setting up, modern heavy rock, what we kind of think of as heavy metal now. Of course, everybody knows about his work with Blue Oyster Cult. But I mean, he had some other groups that he almost worked with, and one especially noteworthy one that he did for the second act of their careers, which I think really, had a good influence on more recent music. Of course, one band was Pentagram, which Pearlman had toyed with signing in the mid '70s. They had been around since I think the late '60s, early '70s, fronted by Bobby Liebling, and they didn't get their first album until '85, basically because of Liebling's extreme egomania and substance abuse problems. But they're considered to be one of the pioneering bands of doom metal now, and a lot of the songs that they had done, they had recorded separate demos and so forth in the '70s, and this stuff had been, kind of wandering around here and there in nuggets type of compilations for years before they were signed, and they had just a great sound. And in more recent years, I mean, it's just been huge in what we kind of think of stoner metal, doom metal, that type of thing. So, I mean, Pearlman had just a great vision with this group. And unfortunately, the egomania of one particular singer kind of ruined what might have been a very fruitful artistic collaboration. And then there's Black Sabbath. Pearlman actually briefly became Black Sabbath's manager after Ozzy Osbourne was booted out in the late '70s, and he was the one who kind of helped them get set up with Ronnie James Dio, which provided Sabbath with a great second act of their career, at least briefly after Ozzy was gone. A lot of people don't talk about it, but the Heaven and Hell album and the Mob Rules album are fabulous. They're certainly better than the last two that Ozzy cut with the group, and probably on par with some of their earlier stuff. And I mean, just really a great collaboration and great thing that Pearlman had set up. And he did that kind of collaboration lead to the famed Black and Blue tour between Sabbath and Blue Oyster Cult in 1980, which is considered a bit of a legendary tour in headbanger circles and so forth. So Pearlman definitely did a lot to shape heavy metal, and it's continued on to this day. But a lot less well known is the influence that Pearlman and BOC had on punk rock. And this is something I know, Chris, you're really into. But briefly, I just wanted to point out, Pearlman was also the guy who had managed the Dictators, kind of an early proto-punk band, and he had helped Patti Smith get her first record contract. Patti Smith had actually been the girlfriend through most of the '70s of Al Lanier, I believe, the keyboardist and guitar player for BOC, and Patti did contribute some early lyrics to their stuff. So
and also vocals too on
yes, on Vera, was it Vera Gemini or something like that?
Very Gemini, but
Jiminy, yes, the great Vera Jiminy. So
one of my favorite songs by them, by the way.
Yeah, that is a great song. So yeah, I mean, Pearlman and BOC were kind of, giving some inroads to the New York scene that was emerging. But I know for you, Chris, it was a specific UK punk band that Pearlman went to work with that's especially dear to your heart in terms of collaborations, right?
Well, yeah, he was picked to produce the Clash's second album, "Give 'Em Enough Rope," which I consider the only album that was actually produced. The Clash made a lot of records, but they weren't actually like produced. They were just sort of recorded. That was the only album where there was a real producer in the seat, driving the sound and really shaping the sound. He really turned them from like a very, very ramshackle garage band to a very slick and powerful, band ready for the arenas. He had a huge influence on the shaping of the sound. I mean, even right down to like he got rid of all their old equipment, which was all junk, and set them up with all new amps and effects and guitars and all that good stuff. So he had a huge influence on them. And again, I consider the album that he produced to be the only album they did that was produced by a real producer.
And it was also, I think you talked about a live performance you saw of the Clash, and I think you said something to the effect that it was Pearlman's version of the Clash is what you saw.
Well, I mean, Pearlman's version of the Clash is basically the Clash that you saw on stage. I had seen them during the London Calling tour, and all the London Calling tour, stuff did not sound like London Calling. It didn't have that album sounds very Stonesy, has a lot of phase in the guitar. I mean, it's very sort of almost bluesy in a sense. It's very trad rock. And when I saw them live, it was like being hit by a train. So that sort of what he called his power mad tendencies. I think whenever you'd go see that band in concert, you would not be seeing the band that recorded, and in some some cases literally, because they used a lot of studio musicians for their albums. But you would see a band that was much closer to Sandy Pearlman's vision of the band. And at one point, he wanted to replace Mick Jones, the guitarist in the Clash, with Steve Jones from the Sex Pistols.
Oh, really?
And he had actually arranged a rehearsal, and he said it was one of the greatest things he ever heard in his life. But Steve Jones was kind of on his way to a serious heroin habit at that point in time, and it didn't work out.
Must have been quite a pity. I could see that being quite a fruitful collaboration. And you kind of described the Clash's live sound as almost transcendental or something to that effect, right?
Well, if you saw them live, again, you would not hear the songs as they were recorded on the albums. First of all, they were very, very loud, and I think this is Pearlman's influence. I mean, Pearlman really got them to get their sound together and get their onstage sound together and get their mix together and their PA sound. So you would definitely get a sense that Pearlman's influence was the influence that stuck, because it was, they were very loud and very aggressive, and just a much different sound than, the sort of the pinnacle of this is if you hear the album Combat Rock, which just sounds like a bunch of sort of lame police covers, like a high school band doing police covers. And then you see you hear the album that they produced or they recorded at Shea Stadium when they're opening up for The Who, and you hear those same songs done very, very differently. So, Pearlman, I really wish that Pearlman had stuck with them and had become their producer manager, because I think their entire history would have been a lot different. And I think they would have been a lot more, they would have had a longer lasting career. Of course, when he split up with Oyster Cult, as you mentioned, he sort of shepherded the marriage of Ronnie James Dio with Black Sabbath, which was, as you said, it was a real second act for them. It was a phenomenally successful comeback for them, because they were sort of seen as, a joke.
Has-beens.
Yeah, they were very much has-beens at that time. And, I think it sort of ran aground with the Born Again album, though. The Born Again album certainly. I think Dave Mustaine said that was his favorite Black Sabbath album. Somebody like that. Somebody like one of these metal luminaries said that the Born Again album was their favorite album, and I do love like the song "Trashed." But I guess Ian Gillan wasn't a real good match, and Ian Gillan was sort of in the middle of getting back together with Deep Purple, which happened, of course, happened the next year with the Perfect Strangers album. So, yeah, I mean, Pearlman, I think the great tragedy is that he never was able to stick with the, a band that could have really come to define him. A lot of the great managers and producers always had a great band that they could sort of partner with. And, BOC was just, there were too many people in BOC. I just think there were too many band members that never works out well. And the Clash were sort of stung by the British rock critics who, particularly at that point in time, were the most useless and evil people on the face of the planet. They gave the Clash a lot of stick because it's like, mainstream American producer, forgetting the fact that this is the guy who discovered the Dictators, and Blue Oyster Cult in their early incarnation were more punk rock than anything in London at the time.
Oh yeah.
So yeah, it's just rock critics are the scum and the filth of the planet. They really are, and I'm saying as somebody who was a former rock critic. Yeah, I think that Pearlman's great tragedy, I guess, he would have been a perfect marriage with the Clash. He and the Clash could have done phenomenal work together. I think that all their records and all their songwriting would have been much stronger if he had stuck on board. And again, Blue Oyster Cult, he was, even as early as Agents of Fortune, they were kind of pushing him out the door in a sense. And then he worked with bands like what was it, Romeo Void? There are a number of bands, like sort of these LA bands, these new wave bands of the early 80s that he kind of got involved with, but that never really took off either. And, it's a real shame. I think that, like you said, the man is a genius, or man was a genius, a phenomenal producer, incredible attention to detail. And, had a lot of vision, had a lot of imagination, had a lot of, it's the kind of thing that, particularly in the 70s and 80s, that made kids love rock and roll so passionately.
Absolutely. And, the thing I would really like to emphasize too, I mean, Pearlman was a very, very intelligent man. I mean, that's something that stands out in every interview that I've read, both with him and interviews from individuals affiliated with his various bands talking about Pearlman. I believe it was Al Bashar, the drummer of BOC, who had referred to him as something like a merit scholar or something to that effect. Essentially, while they were recording the Secret Treaties album in 1974, he was essentially in the studio with them reading these really technical manuals on, I believe, World War II era warfare, like the kind of stuff that only military officers would read. And this was just kind of his, normal modus operandi. The guy was an avid reader, and he tackled a lot of very obscure works. And this is something that we're going to get into throughout this podcast, some of the kind of arcane influences that he was drawing upon, and whether or not he may have had insider sources as well. But
I just want to interject. I mean, one thing that I had forgotten to mention is that he produced Mahavishnu. And Mahavishnu, that was like the peak of musicianship at the time. So not only did he have all these things that you said he had going on, but producing a band like Mahavishnu, you really got to know what you're doing in the studio. You can't just be an amateur like so many rock producers are. You really have to know equipment, you have to know levels, you have to know sound, and that to me, that is just a phenomenal credit, I think, in his resume.
Yes, I mean, he was very much a Renaissance man. He had a very keen interest in science. I believe he ended up personally design the recording studio that he ended up building in L.A. What was it, the Alpha and the Omega or something like that? But yeah, I mean, he understood all the technical aspects of recording as well, in addition to this just really incredible artistic vision that he was able to devise as well. It's just very incredible and mind blowing in a lot of senses. But In terms of influences that Pearlman has cited, one of the big ones that's often bannered about is weird fiction, and there's no question of that. Pearlman grew up in Lovecraft country. He was a very highly acknowledged Lovecraft fan, and there's certainly a lot of allusions to that in BOC. He was also, though, a very big fan of Chambers the King in Yellow as well, and there are references to that in, what was it, ETI or something like that on Agents of Fortune. I mean, this is, back in like the mid 70s, 76 or something like this, decades before True Detective came out. And I mean, Pearlman was already kind of seeding or reseeding popular culture with these references to the King in Yellow and so forth. So, yeah, I mean, he did have those peculiar influences, and he did use the sort of similar technique that Lovecraft and Chambers used, where you had the Necronomicon, this allegedly fictitious book that appears in some of Lovecraft's weird fiction, and with Chambers, it was The King in Yellow, or I can't remember if that was the actual name of the book, but something to that effect, and references to them. In Pearlman's case, it was a kind of epic poem that he devised known as the Soft Doctrines of Imaginos, which would appear in allusions throughout several of the albums, especially during the black and white era, and eventually was kind of turned into a quasi-concept album in 1988. So definitely there was this very strong influence from weird fiction, but Pearlman was also clearly very interested in occult topics. There's a lot of references to alchemy and so forth in BOC lyrics that he penned, and also some kind of far out there conspiracy theories as well, as we will see. So, on that note,
like very, had Pearlman survived, I do wonder if he read The Secret Sun and Visa, because I'm sure he would have, soaked it up. And I'm sure he was a guy that, you and I could really sit down and over a couple beers and really throw down with.
Yeah.
I think he really had a lot of the same kind of ways of thinking. You had mentioned ETI, which is a song off the Agents of Fortune album. One of the things that's I think is kind of remarkable about that song is that it mentions Saucer News, which was Jim Mosley's newsletter for really obscure and esoteric ufology. I know John Keel was very much in that circle, and that song is about ETI is about like being approached by the Men in Black. It's like,
yeah,
three men say, don't report this. I mean, that's sort of like the refrain to the song. So he was very deeply involved in very hardcore occult esotericism, and I think that is very much a reflection of what was going on in New York City. The post Aquarian, post hippie, optimistic, utopian thing. Really, I think it never really took hold in New York the way it took hold in California. I mean, New York's great contribution to psychedelia was the Velvet Underground, right?
yeah, that's not even an especially psychedelic band. I don't even know why they're often lumped into that. That's more of like, I want to shoot up on heroin and just lay around and stare at the ceiling for 6 hours type music.
Well, they were, Warhol packaged them that way.
Yes.
But I'll never forget the great Cher. Cher had gone to see them when they played. I think they played the Whiskey in '66, and she said, they're not an alternative to anything but suicide. So yeah, I mean, New York, you had the Magical Child, and there was that whole scene with people like Peter Levenda and Alan Cabal, and a lot of it would certainly take a much darker turn. As I always say, when you have people in sort of intellectual or bohemian circles messing around with this stuff, it's usually pretty harmless. But once it sort of radiates out into the suburbs and into the trailer parks and the housing projects, it usually takes a much darker turn. And we certainly saw that in '77 with Son of Sam and John Wheaties and that whole crowd.
Yes, absolutely. And that's definitely one of the things we're going to touch on a little bit, whether or not Perlman was dropping some hints about what was coming in the coming years. But so anyway, like let's get in then to the debut album. This was probably with me along with Secret Treaties, my favorite BOC album. But definitely the first thing about this album and the follow-up 1973's Tyranny and Mutations that just, absolutely grabs you from the first time you look at it is the remarkable artwork, the one-of-a-kind artwork. This was the work of one of Perlman's old classmates from Stony Brook University, a Mr. Garlick, I believe is how it's pronounced. He's also the guy who devised BOC's famed kind of Saturn type symbol. You sent me a little documentary on Mr. Garlick. Can you go into him a little bit?
Yeah, he was one of these great lost stories of rock and roll. He was, like you said, he was a friend of the band, and I don't believe that he. I don't believe that he did much like commercially or for other clients. He seemed to be like a sort of a mad shut-in type who would, lock himself in a room with no heat and, do these very esoteric and almost Escher-like. I think there's a real strong MC Escher influence in his work. I don't know if people are familiar with that name, but you can just look it up. But he seemed to be a very strange and marginal character who didn't leave much of a footprint outside of these first two album covers. So I'm not exactly sure. There's so little known about him. Someone had said in that documentary that they had run into him at like a train station on Long Island or something. It was a little nebulous. I'm not exactly sure. How well sourced that is, but it just goes to show the kind of waters this band was swimming in, which is kind of ironic because when Don't Fear the Reaper became such a huge hit, they were sort of lumped in with like, Journey and sort of these, mainstream arena rock bands, which they most certainly were not. I mean, they were a much stranger band. And, when you talk about, it's interesting because even these first two albums don't really reflect it reminds me again this sort of dichotomy with the Clash. I mean, BOC sound was their early sound was almost like proto thrash, very, very fast. I mean, Bruce Springsteen had said when he saw them in the early 70s, he said, I didn't know you could play that fast. Like you were allowed to play that fast or whatever. He couldn't believe how fast they played. And that's something that was going to be a very hard sell in the early 70s, especially on a mainstream label like Columbia. But they were a much more vicious and extreme proto-metal, proto-thrash act than even those first two albums kind of demonstrate, I think.
Absolutely. And I mean, especially when they got to Tyranny and Mutation, I mean, that really is kind of the proto speed metal, thrash metal, whatever you want to call it, the blueprint, really, I think, that was adopted later by Metallica and Megadeth and a lot of those kind of bands. But one interesting thing to leave up with Garlic before we move on, apparently he had dropped out of, I think it was Stony Brook, and he had taken to essentially driving around with a taxi. That was his job, I believe, in the early to mid 70s before the band had lost contact with him, and definitely became a rather eccentric taxi driver. I believe he reportedly kept like a machete or something like that with him. And Perlman went on record as saying when Taxi Driver, the famed Scorsese film, came out, he thought that the Travis Bickle character had been inspired by Garlic. So these were the kinds of bizarre characters that the band spent a lot of time associating with in their early days to give the listeners out there a little perspective. Anyway, so yes, the self-titled debut, it kicks off with Transmanicon MC, which I personally think is a great statement of purpose for the band right at the onset. And musically and lyrically, I think it does a great job of capturing the zeitgeist of the times, the post-Altamont era when psychedelia had really started to give way to heavy metal, when LSD and pot were giving way to heroin and speed and what have you.
Speed in this case, very much
Yes,
speed.
definitely speed. Yes, yes, yes. You know, the whole album, I mean, has just a very sinister, druggy vibe to it, but certainly a much more of a nightmarish, you know, flow to it as well than what you would have expected from albums that had come out even a year or two earlier. But anyway, the song, as the title kind of implies, revolves around a biker gang, and there's a lot of references to Altamont, certainly a reference to the famous murder committed there by the Hells Angels. But Pearlman throws things into a bit of a loop lyrically. It also deals with the secret society that's at the heart of this biker gang, and there's even some implications that Altamont was ritual. Now, I'm going to read a quote here from Pearlman, and for the listeners at home, all these quotes from Pearlman that I'm going to be reading come from a book called Agents of Fortune by Martin Popoff, I believe. It's really the
Oh,
only
I know,
full.
Martin.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, really? Okay, that's
Yeah,
cool.
yeah.
Okay, so but anyway, you know, it's a good book. It's really only full-length book on BOC, and there's definitely some very interesting quotes that Pearlman left in this. But anyway, he said, quotes, "I had created a paranoid explanation for a conspiracy theory, or a proto-conspiracy theory explanation for the events at Altamont. This was to be like the drinking song or club song or whatever, the Mickey Mouse song of the people who were really responsible for Altamont, who were indeed the Transmanicon MC, the club at the secret core of the heart of the Angels, so that there's this life." And then he would go on to talk about how he had been inspired to come up with this idea of writing a book that he was working on in the mid 60s called The History of Los Angeles, which was going into the music scene there. And this is rather odd because LA really didn't have much of a music scene in the mid 60s. It was really just kind of taking off at the time when Pearlman had decided to write a book about it, apparently. And Chris, I understand you're not really a big fan of the LA scene, and certainly there's been a lot of speculation about what spurred it. Could you go into that a little bit?
Well, the LA scene, you know, I got to tell you, I mean, I think Dave McGowan has done did a lot of interesting research, but I think that the LA scene, I think there was too much emphasis placed on it, and you know, particularly in its relation to psychedelia, because you know, you had Love and you had the Doors, and that was pretty much it. You know, there probably was a lot of minor bands thrown around down there, but you know, the Byrds, for instance, who you know, the LA scene was best known for. I mean, I think as early as 68, 69, they went country, you know, and that was seen as like a great betrayal by the psychedelic rock fans. You know, where LA came into its own was all that soft rock singer songwriter, mellow stuff that really took hold in the 70s. But a lot of bands would go to LA to play. There was the London Fog, there was the Whiskey A Go Go, couple other, you know, pretty major venues that were very hot places to play, especially since, you know, a lot of Hollywood people would go and check out these bands. And some of these bands you'd see end up in advertisements or television programs, like, I don't know, like Strawberry Alarm Clock would show up in a movie or something, you know, it's just
Yeah,
like
yeah.
random kind of things. So, you know, LA was really not known as a rock cap, you know, certainly not for rock and roll. And I think it's a real major overstatement to associate the sort of the hippie counterculture with LA. I think that's much more of a San Francisco thing. And I think there are more specific sort of socio-cultural, historical reasons for that. You know, certainly in LA you had Frank Zappa, but, you know, Frank Zappa was very famously straight edge and very famously contemptuous of the psychedelic rock scene and of hippies in general. And then you had also Captain Beefheart and his Magic Band, and he was just on another planet entirely. You know, I'm sure he didn't have too much interaction. He seemed to be a very reclusive guy. So, you know, as far as, you know, the LA thing was concerned, it was certainly a magnet for bands to go play in LA, but it really didn't, you know, produce much of interest, you know, outside of the Doors and Love. I mean, Love were sort of like the second place consolation prize band, and they certainly never reached the heights of fame and fortune that the Doors did.
Yes, absolutely. Love always I thought was insanely overrated anyway, but yeah. But yes, this is why I mean I think it's really odd that he would be working on this, book, The History of Los Angeles and the music scene there in the mid '60s, and kind of going into what the late great David McGowan had been, focusing on with Laurel Canyon and what have you. There has been a lot of speculation as if this was some kind of strange astroturfing or something like that by some type of intelligence, apparatus or something to that effect. And again, it's very odd to me that this project would essentially inspire him to write this song Transmanicon MC, dealing with a secret society at the heart of a motorcycle gang, staging a kind of ritual at Altamont, and that will be a little more pertinent as we get going here a little further.
Well,
Now,
I just want to let me just cut in again here. I mean, one of the things that is not known about Altamont, and I think is sort of misrepresented in a lot of the historical retellings of this, is that those were not actual angels.
Oh, really?
No, they were not. They were pledges. The
Okay.
angels themselves were busy that weekend because there was some sort of turf war going on with another gang, and there was sort of like a biker peace summit. So the angels did not attend that show. It was attended by pledges, guys who wanted to join the angels, wanted to become bikers and so on. And I'm sure a lot of them didn't make the cut because the angels were extremely selective in who they let in. So that's something that I think is kind of misunderstood, that you had a bunch of pledges who were drunk and stoned off their asses and weren't actually like they weren't wearing angels colors and stuff.
Okay. Well, that's definitely an interesting take on that. Yeah, no, because that is definitely widely repeated with the, it was the actual angels themselves there. Correct me if I'm wrong too, but didn't they typically use the pledges to commit crimes in that way, like the actual angel members could kind of be something to the effect of like, well, I haven't, done anything illegal in like 10 years or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah. Pretty much. I mean, that's what, that's what every organization does, shit rolls downhill, right?
Yes, yes, yes. Okay. All right, there's one other song on what would have been the A side of the self-titled I wanted to get into, and that was Before the Kiss, Red Cap. That's another biker-centric song, which also revolves around a secret society as well. And there are references in this song to a place called Conroy's Bar, which in and of itself is kind of interesting. There were actually, from what I could tell with my research, two Conroy's bars. One, they were at either end of the Hampstead Turnpike, which ran across Long Island, and one of them was in Queens Village at Suffolk, and then, it was at Queens Village, and then at the other end of it was at Babylon, the town, which I thought was kind of an interesting name association. And then also, the town of Babylon was apparently very close to Amityville, which was, of course, the location of the notorious murder that was committed in, what was it, '74 or something like that, that the house apparently became haunted, and that had inspired the paranormal investigation and then the Amityville horror and what have you and all that kind of stuff. So, just to kind of give you some insight, this whole area, there was just a lot of strange stuff that was kind of unfolding around there. But anyway, on this song, Pearlman would state, Before the Kiss is another of your pre-classic conspiracy theory takes on the way things work. I persisted that there was a secret organization called the Motif of the Rose, sort of like those French and Belgian fascist organizations, something right-wing. So they sort of ran this place, this bar on Long Island called Conroy's, where Blue Oyster Cult actually used to play at the time, that would induct people into the cult by transferring a drug from the tip of their tongues, extending and retracting the red cap before the kiss. So the drug was the red cap. They delivered the pill, and then you're made a humanoid. Now, the fact that Proman, yeah, definitely is.
Whoa. Yeah, that's pretty heavy. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, the fact that Pearlman would equate this group, the Motif of the Rose, to French and Belgian fascist organizations is very interesting because there were, in fact, a fascist organization in France and I believe Italy that both used rose in their titles. And these organizations were tied into what is commonly referred to as Operation Gladio. Gladio was actually only the name of the Italian branch. We don't know what the whole European-wide network was, but it was essentially a series of stay-behind armies that the United States had set up with the UK in the aftermath of the Second World War. Essentially, in the event that the Soviets had invaded, they could wage a guerrilla war against the Soviet forces. However, these groups were frequently implicated in acts of terrorism and arms trafficking and drug trafficking and a host of other nefarious activities for decades. And yes, it's quite interesting that Pearlman would claim that this secret society was akin to one of these French and Belgian fascist groups. And I believe he made these comments in the 90s, so it's possible, he was kind of embellishing this from his original intention with it, but it's either a great synchronistical linkage or it's a pretty curious limited hangout to some extent. Do you have a take on that, Chris?
I think that's Long Island, or that whole area at that time. We're not that far off from World War II, certainly, and the 30s, which was sort of the heyday of a lot of these groups. And you also have the Cold War, and you had all sorts of weird sects and cults and secret orders weaving in and out of security agencies and government agencies, and it's just the way things were. It wouldn't surprise me that somebody as esoterically minded as Pearlman would sort of like almost pick these guys or pick this thing up on their radar. It's just it's just this guy's story. When we get to Imaginos, he just throws the whole, candy store into the mix there. So I think this is it's just par for the course, not only for this weird, bikey, speed freak milieu that the Oyster Cult arose from, but also the times and the place,
Absolutely. And, I know you had alluded to this a little bit earlier, but from what I understand, Long Island was really awash with a lot of, occult type stuff at the time. Of course, my understanding is this was sort of the birth of the modern Wiccan movement in the United States when two followers of Gerald Gardner had set up shop there around 69. And I believe the Warlock shop was also located in Long Island, if I'm not mistaken, which was where
in Brooklyn, I think.
Brooklyn, yes, which is where Peter Levenda and all these people were hanging out. This was allegedly where the, Simon Necronomicon had been devised, which, incidentally, Pearlman was actually cited at one point as being the author of. So I've definitely wondered if he was involved with that whole group of individuals, and certainly as we go on, I think there is some pretty compelling evidence that he was.
I've never really been able to track down any direct linkage between Levenda and Pearlman, but they had to have known each other. It's just impossible that they didn't. And I'm sure they ran into each other, on many occasions. I just haven't been able to nail down that specific linkage between the two. But it would not surprise me. And again, given Pearlman's very, he was a very erudite individual who had a lot of book learning under his belt, so to speak. It could well be his real name was Samuel, right?
Yep.
So it could have been that he was Simon. Levenda has always denied being Simon himself. Most people who look at it don't necessarily believe him, but it could well be. If anybody was actually fronting this and forking it over to Levenda to distribute, I think Pearlman would be at the top of my suspect list.
Oh, absolutely. And kind of getting into Pearlman's interest in, occult and esoteric things, one last song I want to delve on before we move on from the self-titled is a lesser-known track called Warship of the Telescope. And First, I'll give you guys a little sample of the lyrics here. By silverfish imperatrice, whose incorrupted eye sees through the charms of doctors and their wives. By salamander, drake, and the power that was undying, rise to claim Saturn, ring, and sky. By those who see with their eyes closed, they know me by my black telescope. Now, I can see how a lot of people would think this was gibberish, but Pearlman does display a pretty impressive knowledge of alchemy with these lyrics, and this is specifically what the Sandman said about that. Silverfish imperatrix is the alchemical creature of sorts like the salamander. There are these signature concepts and creatures in alchemy, embodiments of certain alchemical principles, for example, the principle of transformation, which is embodied in several of these alchemical creatures, one being a salamander, which reduces everything to ash. Jung adopted this kind of analytical grid. He thought everything had to be reduced to the blackened state, the burned out state, to an ash before it could flourish again in a new and improved, enhanced, and more evolved, partaking of a higher archival state of form. So silverfish imperatrix is a kind of alchemical creature that I thought up, an embodiment of an alchemical format or alchemical transformation principle. So once you have received the wisdom of the imperial silverfish, your vision then is pretty much perfect. You can see through the lives, not only the lives of appearance, but also through the lives of social structures and political formatting. So you can see through the lives of doctors and their wives, and becomes clear once you know exactly what it's about. So, yes, this is the kind of stuff that Pearlman really thought about, folks. Yeah. For those of you who were kind of doubting that, I mean, Pearlman, was a student of this type of thing, I mean, I hope this has kind of dispelled that. Pearlman was very, very knowledgeable about some rather obscure topics. And I mean, this was, I believe, comments originally, at least when he wrote these lyrics from the late 60s, early 70s, when this kind of, Jungian take on alchemy was only just starting to gain traction as well. So it's very impressive, certainly, and just kind of shows the depth of his knowledge on various topics. But anyway, let's move along. Or did you want to say something, Chris?
Well, I just wanted to say that I'm reading this. I'm just looking at this. I don't know if anybody knows who Cat Ironwood is. Cat Ironwood is she had owned a I don't know if she might still own it, a voodoo store out in California called Lucky Mojo. But she was also involved with like comics fandom and sci-fi fandom, and she's talking about an article that Alan Cabal, pretty well-known article that Alan Cabal had written for New York Press that talks about the scene and talks about Simon Necromonicon. And there were also, interestingly, a lot of people involved in comic books that she mentions at a lot of these sort of parties. But she seems to state pretty plainly that Simon was actually Levenda. So she says this: Levenda, in his persona as Simon, quote unquote, dressed and acted exactly as Alan Cabal describes him, straight appearing and very reserved in a dark business suit and neatly trimmed hair. He was, however, as Cabal implies, a private drug user and heavy-duty psychonaut. So, yeah. So again, I mean, if we were to take Peter Levenda at his word, and anyone who chooses to do so, can do so, but if we were to take him at his word and accept his denials that he was in fact Simon, again, Pearlman is a good candidate for that. But again, I have not been able to, after many years of searching, find any kind of links between the two. So I'll just leave that up to your listeners to kind of put those pieces together, I guess.
Yeah, well, certainly it'll be even more compelling, I think, when we get into some of this other stuff with Imaginos. But real quickly, I wanted to touch on Tyranny and Mutation, the album that came up after the self-titled. I believe this is one of your favorite BOC ones, right?
Yeah, I had gotten this for Christmas when I was 10 years old. So just imagine like that. Because I love the Agents of Fortune album, and my uncle, who was a real hardcore rock guy and had been playing like King Crimson since he was in junior high school, like actually playing it. He was like, musical prodigy and played for the state orchestra, the state youth orchestra. But he had given me a copy. He's like, don't listen to that Agents of Fortune crap. That's just like mainstream, boring shit. Listen to this album. This is the real Blue Oyster Cult. So, which is kind of funny. He kind of got me started in that. So I'm like, in sixth grade, sitting there listening to Tyranny Mutation, with my black lights.
That's great. Yeah, no, I mean, this is definitely, I mean, probably their fastest, their heaviest album. It was definitely quite a groundbreaking record for its time, no doubt. And bizarrely, the Mistress of the Salmon Salt even inspired a card for Magic the Gathering, which I had just remembered going over the notes for this, which I don't know, I thought was really weird. But yes, definitely a classic album and worth checking out if you have not done so already. But I wanted to move on to the next album, which is definitely one of their most esoterically inclined, which was 1974's Secret Treaties album. Now, I think it's significant that this album came out in 74 in general, because this was just a year
Weird year.
yeah, it witnessed a lot of pivotal stuff. I mean, here's just kind of a brief rundown. The Chronicle received what is the last known letter from the Zodiac in January 29th of that year. This was the one where he famously described The Exorcist as, quote, the best satirical comedy that I have ever seen. This was the year that Patti Hearst was kidnapped by the Sudanese Liberation Army and kind of went in through the whole alleged brainwashing thing. And then, of course, the SLA would later have a shootout in that year in May 17th that would lead to the leader, Donald DeFreeze, being killed. So you had all of this kind of crazy stuff playing out with the SLA. Stephen King's first novel, Carrie, was published. May Day 1974 witnessed the dawn raids and arrests of the kind of quasi-cult that grew out of the Nation of Islam that's referred to as the Zebra Killers. They were active in San Francisco around this time and had murdered about 15 people between 1973 and 1974. They're another one of these just really insane cults active in the San Francisco area at that time, though they're not as acknowledged as some of the other ones. Julius Evola, the famed occultist and philosopher, died that year.
Don't forget Philip K. Dick's 2374 experience. Just to back up the calendar a bit, Philip K. Dick had his famous pink beam revelation epiphany in February of 1974.
Wow. Okay. Vannevar Bush also died that year. Of course, he was the wartime administrator of the Office of Scientific Research and Development, which did the Manhattan Project and a lot of other really kind of kooky stuff, including early mind control experiments. He was really just one of the pivotal architects of the military-industrial complex in general. I mean, he was instrumental in wedding academia with the military. And of course, he was the longtime alleged head of Majestic 12. Juan Perón, the Argentinian strongman who had set up the Nazi rat lines in Argentina, died that year. Here's another
Hollywood's favorite fascist.
Yeah, yes. Don't cry for me, Argentina, indeed.
Yeah, like I can never wrap my head around that. You have all these super left wing woke types out in Hollywood and Evita. And Peronism is actually a term for a variety of fascism, and it's just like, what is going on here? It's just it doesn't make any sense to me. But what can you do?
Yes. Okay, here's an interesting one. Christine Schubeck, I believe, committed suicide on air in a broadcast in Sarasota, Florida. From what I've been able to tell, this was the first suicide that had aired live on national TV, and it's believed that it might have been one of the inspirations for Network, which we spoke about last time, that great movie from the mid-70s. Certainly it kind of might have been inspiration for Howard Beale's purported breakdown. The years of lead in Italy were heating up. You had the Italicus Express train bombing that killed 12 people on August 4th. This was probably linked to Gladio and those secret armies I was just talking about. Richard Nixon resigned on August 8th due to the Watergate scandal, which, I mean, this was sort of like what it also touched off later, the investigations into Artichoke and MK Ultra and all that kind of stuff through the Church Commission and what have you. So there were a lot of significant repercussions from that. There were the Amityville murders, of course, which I had gotten into earlier. Those occurred on November of that year, and this would, of course, inspire the famous, horror franchise Amityville Horror. The Arbano message, is that how it's pronounced? It was launched in Puerto Rico, essentially sending out beams to extraterrestrials.
Arecibo?
Yes,
Arecibo.
yes, yes. There you go. There you go. So that was launched in 74. Andrea Puharich published Uri in 1974. This was the first time the public at large had really been kind of clued in on the Nine and all the kooky stuff that was going on with them. Jonestown was established in 1974. And the fantasy tabletop game Dungeons and Dragons was first released in 1974. And
Oh
D&D is,
boy.
of
Yeah.
course, been the site of a lot of controversy too. So yes, folks, there was a lot of really, really weird stuff going on in 1974, and Secret Treaties is probably as good a soundtrack to all of this insanity as any. Now, kind of want to start out with the artwork for Secret Treaties. This was not a Garlic cover. It was the first one that they did without Garlic, but it was still inspired by Sandy Pearlman. And there's some really interesting stuff going on with the artwork in this. So you've got the black and white cover at the front. This shows the band standing in front of an ME-262, which was a famous Nazi plane. It probably would have been great as a fighter plane, but they, for some reason, had used it as a bomber, and it turned out to be a disaster because it was misused, but I don't want to belabor that point. Anyway, there was a figure that appears to be the Grim Reaper sitting in the cockpit of the plane. And anyway, the really interesting thing about the cover is how frontman Eric Bloom is dressed. He has a black cape with a crimson interior, and he is holding the leash of a German Shepherd. And on the back of the album cover, you see the plane. The band is no longer there. You see the plane, which is kind of looking like it's getting ready to go for a takeoff. And there are German shepherds, dead German shepherds, that appear as though they've been ritually murdered, surrounding the plane. And this is really interesting, kind of getting into a lot of the theories surrounding the infamous Process Church of the Final Judgment.
Oh
The
yeah.
the Process Church actually was known for wearing black capes with crimson interiors, and they were also known quite extensively for walking around town with German shepherds on leashes while they were wearing these splendid capes. And of course, you probably are aware of this, Chris, but a lot of people have speculated the Warlock shop, which we were just talking about, where Levenda was hanging out, that there might have been some Process members that were involved with the Warlock shop. So
I'm sure there were. I'm sure
yes,
there
yes, it seems almost certain, but theoretically anyway, and certainly this is kind of another indication that Pearlman was aware of some of the stuff going on with the Warlock shop, and certainly the way he specifically had Bloom dressed on the cover seems to be a dead giveaway to that. And this theme actually seems to have carried on actually to the next album that they released as well, which was a live album called On Your Feet and On Your Knees. It's a depiction of a limo sitting in front of a church. The limo has a flag on it with the blue Oyster Cult symbol, but kind of in a weird, almost Templar-looking setup. But anyway, a reader had actually left a comment in my blog that this church on the cover of the BOC album had been used by the Process, which I thought was ridiculous when they had originally told me that. But I had tracked it down. The church was St. Paul's Chapel, and it's located in South Salem. And if Maury Terry is to be believed, and I've gone on record many times before to say that he should be taken with a huge grain of salt, but Terry did allege in The Ultimate Evil that Salem was in fact a site used by the Process Church, and that they did perform rituals at a church in that area. So
Salem,
yeah,
Massachusetts, or
yeah, Salem, New York.
oh, okay. I'm not
Yes.
familiar with that.
Yeah. But no, definitely it was in around Westchester County, the Northeast County. Yeah, Westchester. So yeah, definitely the artwork for both Secret Treaties and the follow-up live album both seem to strongly indicate the Process Church. And again, this is very interesting, especially in light of the fact that they did allegedly perform very strange rituals at this church around Salem, New York. I believe one of Terry's witnesses had described it as having silver SS lightning bolts that had essentially been fashioned onto the church walls, and a lot of other very strange stuff. So, yes, this is another certainly very curious reference that has been placed into the artwork, and certainly Pearlman was also the guy who oversaw the artwork for On Your Feet and On Your Knees as well. One
Hold
other,
on a sec.
oh yeah,
Salem, New York is not on Long Island though. Salem, New York is upstate.
yes,
It's
yes, yes.
actually right.
It's
It's
by the
right
Borough
near
of
Lake
Connecticut.
George, which is
Okay,
really, I mean, you're almost in Canada at that point. So, I mean,
okay.
you're just about 50 miles or so from Montreal. Oh, actually, maybe about 100 miles from Montreal at that point. So that's pretty far north. Um, because so okay, so the Son of Sam's murders were Queens. Was it Queens? It was Queens, right?
I believe so.
Queens,
I
maybe.
well, I think there was actually a couple of the different boroughs, but yeah, Queens I think was the big one.
But there was a link to Yonkers,
Yeah.
and then on Staten Island, which is it's not really an island, and it's basically part of New Jersey, or it should be part of New Jersey. You have Cropsey
Oh,
in
okay, okay.
the early 80s. And then there was also a process linked to that situation. Yeah, it's interesting for a group that had claimed to be just sort of like a bunch of LARPers. They certainly seem to find themselves in the vicinity of a lot of nefarious goings on, didn't they? Yeah, again, I mean, Maury Terry is, a sensation, or was a sensationalist, but I think there's a lot more, you know, truth that I think a lot of this stuff was being covered up. I think that a lot of this stuff they didn't want to know, like the way that the Carr brothers sort of just suddenly died, just magically died after Berkowitz was arrested. It doesn't seem to me to be like a coincidence, especially, I mean, wasn't John Wheaties there? Wasn't he shot in the head and it was made to look like a suicide? The other one
So
died in like a car crash or
yeah, yeah,
something.
yeah, something to that effect. But yes, yes, and then yeah, the whole area too with North Dakota was just really odd because that was apparently one of the
And what was he doing
outposts.
there? Like, what the
He
hell?
was at the Air Force base, if I'm not mistaken. But I think he had already been discharged from the Air Force at the time. But he was still, kind of hanging around Minot. And according to Terry, that was one of the major regions that the cult was active in, which is kind of odd because obviously there wasn't a lot of new agey type stuff going on in North Dakota in the 1970s.
Well,
But
no, hold on. There was the UFO incidents at Minot Air Force Base. So
okay, that's interesting. But
yeah, pretty well known events. I'm not exactly. Let me just keep talking. I'll find out what year that was.
But the other interesting thing, though, is that was a major hotbed for Christian identity groups, especially kind of tied in with these, militias and what have you. And specifically, one of the guys who had been active in that area was the infamous Gordon Kahl. For those of you who don't remember Gordon Kahl, he was kind of like the Cliveden Bundy of the 1980s, if you will. He was one of these, sovereign citizen types who had refused to pay income taxes for decades or something to that effect. And anyway, he and a couple of his kids got in a huge gun battle with U.S. Marshals, I think in 1981 or something like that. And Kahl pretty much killed all of them. And that had touched off a large manhunt for him kind of across the Midwest and the South and what have you. And Kahl had, of course, leaned on this Christian identity network to cover him up. And I've always found that to be quite interesting because when you look at a lot of the regions that Terry had cited as being big hotbeds for the process cult, such as in Texas and the Houston area and LA and so forth, a lot of these areas also dovetail with this Christian identity network, especially in North Dakota, Houston. Of course, LA was really the area where a lot of it originally came from. I mean, this was where the ministries, quote unquote, of William Potter Gale and Wesley Swift were based out of. So certainly that is very interesting, especially in light of the fact that the Christian Identity Network has been deeply, deeply implicated in acts of terrorism for decades in this country. There was actually an excellent and very scholarly book written about this recently called American Jihad, rather apt title, but certainly that is a rather interesting aspect of all of this, these allegations that Terry has made, which Terry himself seems to have done everything in his power to ignore, I might add. Anyway, Chris, did you find what you were looking for?
Yeah, the UFO incidents at Minot started in the 60s, mid 60s. I guess 66 was the first one, and there were a number of others. Actually, I'm sorry, this is going back to 64, 76, 72. There were a number of fairly well documented UFO incidents at Minot. So that's a very strange place for John Wheaties to show up. And it just kind of goes to show how ufology or UFO phenomena is tied up in so much of this insane weirdness, you know?
Oh, absolutely. Well, there is a rather strange Sovereign Order of St. John connection to all this. And as we've kind of talked about, there's a lot of weird connections between the SOSJ and UFOlogy as well. But that's a topic we're going to get into in another show, which should be quite a barn burner.
And well, getting back to the whole thing with secret treaties again, and also the process. Sam, who Berkowitz claimed to be the son of, was a German Shepherd.
Yes. And, also another one of Pearlman's nicknames for himself was actually Memphis Sam.
Oh, really? Well, I guess that sort of makes sense because of, Sam, but I don't think that Pearlman had any.
Yeah, I don't think he was communicating to Pearlman. The Berkowitz was communicating to Pearlman, but yeah, I think that's kind of at a level where synchronicity is just kind of starting to take over, and you start seeing all of these other sort of crazy coincidences deriving out of the actual stuff that was connected, But on that note too, one other thing I wanted to point out with the cover was this odd little inscription that appears on it. It's in the inner sleeve, and it's a cryptic note that reads Rosanow's curious, ablet simply titled book, The Origin of a World War, spoke in terms of secret treaties drawn up between the ambassadors for Platonia and Destinova, the foreign minister. These treaties founded a secret science from the stars, astronomy, the career of evil. And this is also certainly quite interesting. And this book would be alluded to occasionally, the origins of a world war and several other works, but this also played into all the, kind of weird Imagino stuff and so forth. And certainly we'll see Platonia and Destinova more as we go into this as well. But this kind of goes into sort of this weird Lovecraftian motif that Pearlman used lyrically in some of these albums with these references to these non-existent books and what have you. It was just really, another layer of just all of the stuff that he was weaving in this, which I think is very interesting. But anyway, moving along. So this was the first time that the Imagino stuff really got a lot of play, was in Secret Treaties, and it was also the first time that we were introduced to the character of Imaginos, who's also known as Destinova. He appears in two songs in this album, Subhuman and the closing track, Astronomy. And in the case of Subhuman, this essentially was expanded upon in the Imaginos album when it was retitled Blue Oyster Cult. But the song basically refers to how he is essentially, some of his friends attempt to murder him. As he's dying, he starts to realize that he's some kind of strange extraterrestrial being or something, and makes a pact with elemental spirits. It's a little hard to follow, but yes, it's definitely a very
Why wouldn't it be?
yes. It's quite a curious track, and the things really get going though. Well, I should say also there's also the great Dominant Submission on the A side. That's the song I've written about in length, and I think that's really kind of a send up of the music industry and just the kind of sinister forces going around it. Of course, I kind of got into that recently with the post I did, Kingdoms of the Radio. The title that was actually a reference to the Dominance and Submission album and so forth, or the song Dominance and Submission. And then of course you've got the Nazi revering ME262. Of course, the title Secret Treaties, there's two theories about that. Some people think Secret Treaties was a reference to a treaty that humanity, or at least secret societies within humanity, had made with an extraterrestrial species. Others think it was reference to secret treaties that we had made with the Nazis. It might have been both. But certainly they did kind of play into that with ME262, and this was around the same time where they had created a flag for the band that essentially looked like a Nazi banner, other than the fact that it had the BOC symbol instead of a swastika. So,
well, that's one of the interesting things about Pearlman, though, is that he was he collected Nazi memorabilia.
And he was Jewish, though, too.
Which was very interesting. But also, it's interesting too that the Clash had done a photo shoot, and it was kind of a one-off for them. But they had dressed in all this military regalia, and actually, it's really interesting because the photographer who shot the images went on to work with, like, I think the Backstreet Boys, some like really strange boy band, but he had photographed in all this period regalia that I believed belonged to Pearlman. So, for instance, Paul Simon dressed as an SS officer, and Mick Jones dressed in like this kind of Boer or Crimean War type of regalia with the leopard skin and so on. It was and interestingly enough, Joe Strummer had dressed as I don't know, like some sort of serial killer. It was just a very bizarre. It was a very bizarre photo shoot that they had never really repeated, but certainly seems to me to be part of Pearlman's, his influence. So very interesting connections there. And again, I mean, we're looking at this strange netherworld. The fact that John Carr dies at Minot. Minot was known for all this UFO phenomena. We have links with this whole constellation with the Warlock shop and the Magical Child and other places, other similar stores around that area. You had people like Levenda sort of weaving in and out of this scene. This is this very weird mixture of pop culture, speed freak culture, conspiracy culture with actual conspiracy.
Yes.
There's a very, very heavy, frothy brew. Let's just say that. I do find it interesting that Oyster Cult really made it an effort to distance themselves from this kind of stuff when they split with Pearlman. I think a lot of that had to do with just trying to maintain a mainstream rock career, and I think Pearlman might have been seen as just a little too weird for the most of the rest of the industry. Because again, like I said, he went from working with Sabbath and Oyster Cult, and you would mention that tour, the Black and Blue tour, which is a huge success and really kind of a coup on his part, to working with a lot more marginal kind of acts. So I do wonder if he was seen as being just a bit too strange for the industry and a bit too well read, and maybe he could like you said, in regards to the process with these album covers and these clues in the artwork. I mean, maybe he was trying to tell tales out of the school, which will always get you blacklisted in that industry.
Yeah, well, absolutely. And another thing that I had forgotten to mention too, he was actually a friend of Ed Saunders too, going back to I think 66 or 67 when he had tried to set up the Fugs playing at Stony Brooks University. And of course, Saunders published The Family in 1971. I mean, that was kind of the first time, where the process, the allegations linking the process to the Manson family had come out. And then you kind of look at how Pearlman was writing songs like Transmanicon MC about these biker gangs with this weird secret society at the core. And Manson was out there in LA hanging out with these, straight Satan type biker gangs and all this other stuff. And, allegedly the process was kind of manipulating all this. So, yeah, it's it's really really interesting. And another point I would kind of bring up too, BOC really kind of started to distance themselves from Pearlman around 76 when Agents of Fortune came out, and that only continued. And this was also around the time that they really gave up on trying to record any of the songs on the Imaginos album as well. And incidentally, I mean, this was also, I think, around the time that the stuff with Son of Sam started to come out. I think Berkowitz was arrested in what, 77, 78 or something like that. You had like the Monica Heller stuff come out in 79, which had kind of exposed this strange S&M scene that involved Roy Radin and what have you. And I think that also took
that was all Long Island, yes.
Yeah, that was all in Long Island too. And then a couple of years later, he ends up with the Cotton Club murders and what have you. So, yeah, it's kind of interesting that, yeah, Pearlman's sort of fall from grace began right around the time this stuff started to come out and sort of became complete around the time of the Cotton Club murders and so forth.
Well, he did. I'm sure you know this because aside from Luminos or Imaginos, I'm thinking of an old, I think, Outer Limits episode. But he did Club Ninja with Oyster Cult in '85. You know, because he did have a sort of a long period where he was not working with them. But I think '85 was just, they were just so far out of their time zone that it was just pointless to even try. I think at that point in time. Because one of the things that I should point out too is that Oyster Cult were really part of late psychedelic rock and acid rock. I know a lot of people sort of see them as a metal band, but I would lump them more specifically in with late acid psychedelia, because they weren't as blues based and they were more melodic, and they seemed to have a lot more influences from 60s pop and so on. So I think they were just a lot more
well, they were also, I would say, a lot more like, they were a lot more atmospheric, like, whereas Sabbath or Deep Purple, I mean, they really kind of just bludgeoned you with those heavy riffs, whereas BOC could just kind of evoke this really really sinister atmosphere, even in latter periods when they weren't really didn't have the old magic, so to speak. They had a great skill at that.
Well, the other thing that I'd like to point out too is that he stops working with Oyster Cult and starts working with the Clash, right?
Mm-hmm.
And as far as I know, I believe that he went out to California after that and started working, trying to develop acts and trying to develop, a studio and so on. So he had really removed himself from the whole New York scene, and you refer to, what would happen with Roy Radin and the Cotton Club murders, and also, the aftermath of this Berkowitz thing and Cropsey in the 80s. He had really kind of taken himself out of that, because he was working at the Automat in San Francisco, and he was working with 415 Records, and 415 is was the area code for San Francisco at the time. So he was, basically set up for the most part in California. I don't know if there was a certain connection there. I don't know if there was like a motivation to get out of that whole bad craziness that was going on in New York at the time, but he certainly did so. I mean, that's pretty well documented.
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting, like I said, especially in light of the fact that was kind of right around the time, the late 70s, early 80s, when a lot of that stuff was also being exposed to the general public for the first time as well. So yeah, definitely.
When was The Ultimate Evil written? What year was that?
I think it was 87, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
Yeah, it was. So, I mean, that's kind of another interesting thing. Obviously, Terry did have the publications and what was it, Murdoch's New York Post, I believe, that had kind of originally gotten into this a little bit around 78, 79. But a lot of the material, though, that Terry had been working on did not come out until, a good decade or so after Pearlman had already started to drop some of these hints in the early BOC albums, certainly. So, I mean, it is all very suggestive and seems to stretch coincidence.
Well, I've told you that I've always seen the process church as essentially a drug smuggling operation. That's been my sort of personal interpretation when I look at their where they were, their travels, where they end up, and the sort of the events that kind of emerge from that. So if there was a process splinter or a process branch or something set up in the New York area, on Long Island, Staten Island, Yonkers, I mean, just whatever in that area, as Berkowitz has claimed, and Terry had written about, that would certainly explain a lot as far as a lot of the things that were going on, because so much of this stuff that we're looking at, is arises out of drug abuse, right? I think that a lot of Jesus, just go back to the the Nazis themselves, and the Nazis were huge speed freaks. They were huge speed abusers. I think that kind of goes a long way.
Yeah, including Hitler himself.
Yeah, including Hitler himself. I think that goes a long way in explaining, what really formed that, because you would see a lot of, I mean, you don't see it so much anymore, I don't think, speed, well, scratch that, because of course we have meth, right?
Yeah, meth.
But I think that you had a speed culture that had sort of speed metal and so on, and if you look at where obvious speed abuse is intersecting with culture, you see a lot of flirtations with Nazism and Satanism and militarism and all these kind of darker, harder things, which I think is a direct. I think it comes directly out of the speed abuse. I really do. I think that the way hard rock, or the way, say, acid rock sort of morphed into metal in the late 60s, early 70s, I think a lot to do with, people moving away from LSD and other kinds of hallucinogens, more into speed, more into heroin, more into cocaine, these much harder drugs that really do a much bigger number on your head than I think softer drugs that were popular in the mid 60s would do.
Absolutely. And I mean, you even kind of saw that like reflected in the movies of the time too, from some of the sort of, idealistic, early psychedelic films that you sort of saw done in the late 60s, like Head and the Trip and that type of thing. And then going into the early 1970s, you had the great cult classic Vanishing Point, which was a very, romanticized take on speed. But I mean, even then, the main character, Kowalski, just basically, hopped up on amphetamines, leads police on a massive cross-country chase, and just ends up committing suicide. And really, he does all of it for almost no real reason. It's just, yeah, I mean, kind of a pointless exercise in a lot of ways. So yeah, I mean, definitely this was a very much something that was really shaping the culture at the time, and did produce some very curious works of art, no doubt.
Yeah, but I think I think there was just a specific. I think it was Steve Vai. Okay, so are you familiar with Steve Vai?
Steve, do you mean the guitarist?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So Steve Vai had sort of, he was looking. He said something very interesting, and he was talking about how musical styles and taste would sort of coincide with what the popular drugs at the time were, and he talked about like all this shredding kind of 80s post Van Halen type of guitar playing was very much inspired by cocaine use, right?
Absolutely.
And then when you get into the 90s and grunge, well, I mean, really, you could trace this a little, you can go back a little bit, because grunge starts to emerge in the mid 80s. it's just not recognized. I mean, I remember hearing bands being described as grunge in like 83, 84. So, there's sort of some controversy. But, Vi had said, that was like heroin. That was a lot of the people who were involved in that scene were very influenced by heroin use. I mean, even if they weren't using it themselves, I mean, it just sort of seeps into the culture. So I think a lot of the stuff that we saw in the 70s and 80s, stuff that you've researched, and even with a lot of these secret societies and political sects and so on and so forth, I think a lot of it is very much driven by drug use and drug abuse. I think that you can't separate the two. And I think this is something when people sit down and write these very scholarly and erudite texts, for big university publishers, that I don't know if they really, you should almost start with the drug abuse. I think that the ideology and the behavior and, whatever kind of political violence, whatever sort of falls on with this, should really almost, be seen as byproducts of the drug abuse. I think that in a lot of analysis, particularly about political extremism and religious or sectarian or cult extremism, I think that there's a real tendency to sidestep around the drug abuse when I think that should be front and center. I honestly do. I really believe that. I think that the drug abuse really needs to be like the starting point and then go from there. I really do. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised, you talked about a lot of these Christian identity groups, the Order, a lot of these groups that were operating in the Western states in the 70s and 80s. I certainly wouldn't be surprised if a lot of these guys were off their heads on speed as well. I think that's something that can't be overlooked. I mean, a lot of these people wouldn't necessarily cop to that, but I think it's very, very much a strong possibility.
No, I think so as well. And I mean, I know at least in one case, the Covenant, the sword in the arm of the Lord. They claim that the guys who had comprised this cult, I think it was in Arkansas or something like that, were recovered drug addicts, quote unquote. But yeah, I mean, pretty much, yes, he just basically rounded up all of these former, heroin and meth heads and stuff and brought them out in the middle of nowhere in Arkansas and created this cult. And they, found this white Aryan Jesus that told them that Jews were demonic beings and so forth, and that got them to clear their heads. Yeah, I find that to be rather dubious, to put it mildly. So yes, I do definitely think that there could be something to that. And another interesting thing on that topic too, with the Order of St. John, the longtime Grand Master Charles Pichel, he had actually been arrested for drug trafficking in the 1930s, and his explanation for this was that he was running a drug rehabilitation center, essentially, where he was giving heroin to his patients, but he was gradually lowering the doses so that they would get off of the heroin, and this would, was giving them an alternative to the mafia or something to that effect. So, yeah, there have been definitely hints at that for a very long time.
Yeah, I think so. And also, it's also a lot of these groups, that will be involved in certain sexual activities. At the same time, they're crusading against the same sexual activities that they're taking part in secret. I think that is another part of this. I think that the again, the amphetamine psychosis and other types of extreme behavior inform extreme ideology, and in those cases that you cited, I mean, who knows where else it leads to? When you talk about this demi-monde, when you get into this demi-monde of people who are transgressive in some way, whatever way politically or sexually or pharmaceutically, or involved in activities or violence, there tends to be much more of a constellation of behaviors and activities that aren't necessarily acknowledged. There's that guy what's that guy's name? The fundamentalist Mormon guy who had that compound out in what was it, Nevada? You know who I'm talking
Oh,
about.
yeah, I know who you're talking about. Oh, shoot, name's not coming to me off the top of my head though.
Yeah, I don't remember his. I believe that compound is still there, by the way. But you know, he was raping all the little boys in the bathroom and stuff, and you know, at the same time, he's pushing this sort of biblical family values kind of thing. So I mean, I think that's just a lot more common than people are willing to um, you know, acknowledge. And I think in the sense of the 70s and 80s, when you had this weird, you know, the Cold War sort of made fellow travelers out of, you know, extreme ideological sects, drug runners, organized crime, people sort of on the fringes of culture creation. Yeah, just, you know, this weird coalition of marginal types who just seem to find each other. You know, somehow they seem to, you know, it's almost like they have a gravitational pull towards one another. They, you know, you find this, and certainly your work on Bicep has done a fabulous job at uncovering a lot of these connections. But you have a lot of groups that are involved in this stuff that just seem to find each other somehow. You know, I'm not
Yeah,
exactly sure. And in the case of you know, certainly the Cold War, I'm sure it's not much different now. But certainly in the case of the Cold War, that you know, we hear so many reports of how prevalent this stuff was, as you know, as far as being funded by the government. You know,
yeah,
so again, you know, if you had Pearlman, who was sort of working in New York with this New York-based band, and then sort of splits up with them, and you know, shoots over to London, and then shoots over to California, and then you also have the, you know, the Oyster Cult trying to present themselves as a much more mainstream act in the later 70s and the early 80s. You know, you really have to do wonder what is motivating this, other than just, you know, artistic inclination.
yes. I mean, it's definitely very suspicious in light of a lot of the other stuff that was going on. But let's get back here to Secret Treaties right quick so we can wrap this sucker up. So on the B side, there was two other songs that I wanted to tackle right quick. One was Flaming Telepaths, which is another interesting track, which
Great
Perlman.
title.
Yeah,
Great
it
title.
is. It is, which Perlman also wrote, and this basically goes into the military use of telepaths, which is really interesting because, again, you know, this is right at the same time when all this stuff with SRI was really taking off, and the remote viewing program going on right there, and what have you, and
And
yes, I mean,
not being acknowledged, by the way. You know, I mean,
yes, and
not
not
being
being acknowledged
publicized.
either. So, yeah. I mean, at this time, it was highly, you know, secretive as well. And then Perlman just happens to slip a song at the end of the album, and here going into military using telepaths and stuff like that. Another one of those sort of weird coincidences with this kind of stuff. And then Flaming Telepaths immediately bleeds into what's probably my favorite BOC strong song, Astronomy. And this is just a really deep track, but I personally think that Astronomy is describing a magical ritual. It features several, or at least two characters that appear in several other songs. One of them is Susie Deer. She also appeared in Before the Kiss of Red Cap, and she also appeared in another song on the Secret Treaties album that's in Dominance and Submission. She was naturally a character that Perlman had dreamed up, and appears in mostly Imaginos-centric songs, with the exception of the Marshall Plan. And this is also the other appearance of Imaginos in this album. And like I said, I actually think that this is describing some kind of sex magic ritual or something to that effect. Al Bashard was the main songwriter, at least for the music behind it, and he had rearranged Perlman's lyrics a little bit. The first verse had originally been somewhere in the middle of the song. So the song would have opened with this verse here. Come, Cece dear, let's take a walk just out there upon the beach. I know you'll be married soon and you want to know where winds come from. Well, it's never said at all on the map that Carrie reads behind the clock back there, you know, at a Four Winds bar. Now, this has been sort of interpreted by some fans as these two women, Carrie Deer and Susie Nurse, having some kind of lesbian experience, which I do think is kind of what happened, but it was in a very ritualistic sense. And from there, it goes into Four Winds at the Four Winds bar, two doors locked and the windows barred, one door left to take you in, the other one just mirrors it. And hellish glare and inference, the other one's a duplicate, the queenly flux, the eternal light of the light that never warms, that never, never warms. And this is really kind of complicated, but I do find the references to mirrors here to be very interesting because scrying would definitely play a big role later in the Imaginos album. In fact, I think Pearlman even put some spiel about John Dee deliberately in the album cover and so forth. And this is just really fascinating to me because I don't really know what it is, but scrying really seems to come up in a lot of very high ritual mass magic. Of course, it was famously used by John Dee to receive the Enochian keys. It would later be used by Crowley in several prominent rituals. The group of Italy, which a young Julius Evola cut his teeth in, used scrying for several of their rituals. Later, Alan Greenfield would use it for some of this, secret ciphers of the UFOnauts type stuff. And I've even seen references to it in some of the Native American cultures, the Aztecs, the Hopewell, and so forth. I don't really know what it is about scrying, but it seems to be a highly effective practice, and certainly there's a great depiction of this in the Netflix show Requiem, for those of you interested in this type of thing. Chris, were you about to add something?
Yeah, I was going to ask you, did you happen to ask Alan Greenfield about Sandy Pearlman? I wonder if they had any encounters, because it seemed to me, at least at some point in the 60s, maybe the early 70s, that they were kind of moving in and out of each other's orbits in some way. I really do wonder. I'd love to ask Greenfield if he knew Pearlman at all.
I did not get a chance to ask him that, but that is a great question. I'll see if I can pass that along to him and figure it out, because yes, that would be quite interesting to know if Greenfield and Pearlman had encountered one another at some point. But so anyway, it kind of seems like with this song, they performed this possibly quasi-sex magic ritual, maybe involving mirrors, and then they're able to summon a being, and that is Destinova, the eternal light. And he is often associated with a dog, which he describes as being fixed and consequent. And there's been a lot of speculation that this is actually a reference to Sirius, the dog star, which I think is quite plausible since Sirius does play a lot in the Imaginos album. And I believe Pearlman had actually wanted Sirius on the album cover as well. So this is kind of another strange trope from all of this weird stuff and from the 70s. The whole thing with Sirius and Robert Temple as well that we're kind of seeing here.
Robert Anton Wilson. Yeah, there was a lot of this stuff in that whole milieu that that we're kind of referring to here, that post-hippie occult milieu. I think that Sirius was very much a discussion. I think it just goes to show just how much Pearlman was marinating in and all this stuff,
Yeah. And I mean, just especially this album alone. I mean, of course, it came out in the pivotal, 1974 year. It's got digs at the manipulation of rock and roll and its fascist tendencies with dominance and submission. It addresses, for instance, hints at reemerging Nazism with ME262, the weaponization of telepaths and flaming telepaths. And then you've got this bizarre track ending it with these references to ritual magic, and then, of course, and Sirius.
And star magic.
Star magic, specific.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. And then on top of all of that, you've got these strange references to the Process Church in the artwork. I mean, I don't really know of another album that totally captures the zeitgeist of a particular era the way this one does. It's really quite remarkable.
Yeah, but it's interesting to me because it seems to me that Pearlman might want to informed people about the process and kind of what they're up to, but was probably understandably afraid of repercussions from that. So I do wonder, if there's a lot of coded messaging going on in that regard, because I think I don't know, I wouldn't necessarily call them a spent force by that point in time. I'm sure there was still a core left of that group, but considering the fact that I do believe that they were essentially a cover for a drug smuggling operation, those aren't people that you necessarily want to piss off,
Yeah, absolutely. Which I think also might have been why. I mean, he had waited to 1988 to finally get the Imaginos album out. Of course, they had started recording it, I think, in '81 or something. This was after Al Bashard, the drummer of Blue Oyster Cult. And Bashard was also a hell of a songwriter. He actually wrote the music to a lot of their big hits as well. So kind of another, this is sort of at the point, I think, when the cult was really in self-destruct mode, because they basically jettisoned Pearlman. I mean, he was still involved with the group, but mainly as a manager. He had very little involvement after the early '80s, and then they kicked out their best songwriter, Al Bashard, as well. So yeah. But anyway, Bashard and Pearlman hooked up, and then that's when they started recording what would become the Imaginos album. And Bashard was apparently the only one who was still real into the Imaginos cycle up to this point. The rest of the band had pretty much refused to write songs based around those lyrics, but Bashard had continued to do that. And they originally had finished around '84. They presented the record to CBS, and they rejected it flat out. On the basis that Bashard's vocals sucked. And, in fairness, they weren't that great. I've heard the original cut, and certainly they do leave something to be desired. But, again, you got to kind of wonder. It wasn't until '88 when this album saw the light of day. And that in and of itself is kind of odd, because apparently CBS gave Pearlman and Bashard a fortune to record this. I mean, they had an impressive list of studio musicians on this, including Steve Vai himself. They had what's his name, Robbie Kruger from The Doors. It was quite a roster of studio musicians and what have you they had on this record. They'd spent several years recording it. They'd spent just tons of money on it, and yeah, CBS had no interest in recording it. And finally, Pearlman had managed to talk Eric Bloom and Buck Dharma into coming in and essentially just recording vocals for it over the ones that Bashard had originally done. And after all the hoopla, it finally came out in '88, which, I think was a year or something like that after The Ultimate Evil had been published. So some of this stuff had already been kind of revealed at that point when it was finally released to the general public.
Well, again, '88 and Blue Oyster Cult, just forget it.
Yeah.
It's just like there was a great interview I saw with I forget who it was, but somebody in the early thrash scene, and they were talking about how how offended they were by Foghat's mustaches. Like they just look like they're 80. They were 40 years old or something. And I think that Blue Oyster Cult weren't even a memory at that point. I think that the metal scene had moved on so rapidly and so completely that anybody from 70s sort of quasi metal, quasi hard rock. I mean, even Sabbath were over. Sabbath were making. Tony Iommi was making a bunch of not great albums with this roster of interchangeable sidemen and playing clubs. Forget it. I mean, Blue Oyster Cult would just be, in 1988. I don't know how old you are, but I was 22, and I was very much involved in the music scene at that point in time. And if you said Blue Oyster Cult to anybody, they would kind of look at you like, "What the hell are you talking about? Blue Oyster Cult? Are you serious? I mean, Don't Fear the Reaper? I mean, what do you mean? Like, why are you even bringing this up?" So it seems to me that the album was probably just released because there were contracts involved and so on. And it was almost like Columbia, they certainly didn't need Blue Oyster Cult. I mean, they had Michael Jackson, right?
Yeah.
So they didn't need, they probably just released it just to release it, just to, get it out of the pipeline and get, Pearlman out of their hair. So I think that, but again, I mean, just forget it. Nobody at all cared about this band at that point in time. Nobody cared about any of these bands, any of these '70s bands that, weren't, AC/DC or Van Halen, weren't like the front row. It's just forget it. Nobody was talking about Blue Oyster Cult. I mean, if they were playing anywhere, they'd be playing mid-size auditoriums or clubs. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if they were even like on the state fair circuit at this point in time.
Oh yeah, no. I mean, it wasn't. I know a few years later in the mid '90s. I'm from Florida, the Daytona Beach area, and I don't know if you know this, but one of the big things in Daytona Beach were the Bike Week festivals that they would do every year in March, and you'd have all the bikers from across the South who would descend on Volusia County and Daytona Beach and what have you. And yeah, one of my buddies told me the story about how once in like the mid '90s, '95, '96, he actually saw Blue Oyster Cult playing the lodge of a Holiday Inn for Bike Week.
Yeah, yeah, that's incredibly sad, but I
Yeah.
totally, I totally believe it. I gotta say, I mean, it's to me, it's a shame when you read about all the themes that Pearlman was talking about with Imaginos and was kind of playing with. Like, you really wish he'd written it as a novel.
Yeah.
Maybe that wasn't his bag. He wouldn't be, feel comfortable with that. But the whole storyline and just the way he throws in all these elements, you really wish that he had been a little more ambitious in putting this out to the public than with, like the most has-been of has-been bands at that point in time.
Absolutely. And I mean, it really is just a remarkable, quasi secret history, if you will, of the modern era, essentially what he weaves on the Imaginos album. Of course, it kicks off with Less Invisibles, which essentially goes into the indigenous spirits, the gods, and what have you that inhabited the New World as the Spanish came. And he also incorporates a lot of kind of references to voodoo and what have you in this. And kind of, again, getting back to the whole Warlock thing, I definitely think there might have been something taken from, was it the Gnostic Vodoun system of Michael, is it Petro or something like that? Do you know who I'm talking about?
I have no idea who you're talking about.
Okay. But
Yeah.
yeah, he was another guy. I mean, he was kind of in the Crowleyan system, but he had tried to combine it with kind of the indigenous Voodoo practices and what have you. But this was another guy who was again hanging out in the whole Warlock shop scene in New York and the early '70s and what have you. So that's another sort of system that Pearlman kind of seems to be incorporating in here. Of course, you've got, like I said earlier, all the references to John Dee, to scrying, to these magical mirrors. In fact, essentially Pearlman argues that it's this cursed mirror that Imaginos takes from the New World back to Europe that lays the seeds for the Second World War. You have, as I sort of talked about before, his death in the song Subhuman, where he realizes that he's part of this kind of stellar civilization and so forth, that he's kind of a physical embodiment of them in Earth. And then just the whole thing with the magical ritual that resummons him and so forth. Of course, originally, Bouchard and Pearlman had intended this to be a double album, and the first half would have, which is essentially what we get with the Imaginos album, covers his life from the middle of the 19th century up until his death, and then resummoning at the beginning of the First World War. And had it continued, it would have gone on to the Second World War and gotten more into the extraterrestrial stuff and the treaties with the Nazis and all this other stuff. I mean, kind of a hint of that was shown in ETI, the song that we discussed earlier. That was actually one of the songs in the Imaginos cycle that would have gone into some of the events that were happening in the
Oh, is
latter.
that right? I didn't realize
Yes,
that. Yeah.
yes.
Well, they
So
do
I mean,
talk about the King in Yellow in that, right?
yeah. That's what I'm saying. I mean, the King in Yellow, the references to the Men in Black, I mean, just, almost all of these tropes that he was bringing out. I mean, this Enochian magic, these other kind of weird Crowleyan systems based on Voodoo and things like that, these secret societies, these conspiracies trying to manipulate the world, and the fact that they're being driven essentially by this kind of non-human intelligence, this extraterrestrial intelligence, these kind of Lovecraftian
Old
old
ones.
ones. Yes, exactly, and all of this. So, I mean, it's just remarkable, heady brew. Did you have a chance to listen to the album?
Yeah, well, I've listened to it in the past. I haven't listened to it recently, but it's you can certainly see it sounds very much like a '70s album with like '80s production values. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah,
But
absolutely.
the the composition, the songwriting kind of aesthetic is very '70s, I think.
No, absolutely. But I mean, it's just I mean, that's really, I would say, the major knock on it is certainly the production is kind of dated now, and you do have some of these kind of 80s flares to it. Certainly, I really wish the band would have tried to have done this in the 70s. One can only kind of imagine what the direction they might have gone in if this was the type of album that would have been the follow-up to Secret Treaties rather than Agents of Fortunes. And Agents of Fortune has a lot going for it. I mean, Vera Gemini, Don't Fear the Reaper. Sorry, yeah.
No, go ahead. Yeah, I was just
You
gonna.
know,
Yeah.
yeah, no, I flub things. I know. But yeah, I mean, certainly though, but I mean, if they had gone in this direction with that same kind of, sleazy production aesthetic from the black and white albums, I mean, you really could have been talking about something just truly pivotal. I mean, I think what would have been certainly Pearlman's masterwork, but this was also around the time, like we've been kind of getting in before, some of this, weird stuff that was going on in Long Island was starting to finally see the light of day, which was probably a factor in why Pearlman wanted to get out of there and why the band wanted to start going on a more of a conventional direction, such as doing peons to sex with groupies and a bag of cocaine and those other types of deep topics.
Well, it's interesting though, because if you look at Agents of Fortune, that was like a favorite for a lot of these preachers to scream about back in the day, because of the tarot imagery and so on. And it's like, if they had known then what we know now about the influences behind that, they would certainly be a lot more upset about it. But we had the very next album after that is Spectres, which has Godzilla, which is just like the big dumb rock song of your, that's almost like a prototype for your big dumb rock 80s, big
novelty song or
no, not even like novelty song, but just like your big dumb riff 80s.
Oh yeah, I get what you're
the
saying.
Kind of stuff that it almost seems to be like a prototype for that. Dun, 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 it's just like, it's almost like a self-parody. But you also had Going Through the Motions, which was very pop, very mainstream pop, which I always wondered why that wasn't a bigger hit than it was. Because it's a great song, and it was co-written with Ian Hunter of Mott the Hoople. And it's a great production job, and I just always wondered why that song wasn't a bigger hit than it was. But maybe people weren't expecting it. I'm not exactly sure, but but then they did stuff like Burning for You and Joan Crawford, and stuff got like very mainstream after that. I think that they were really trying to Going Through the Motions didn't even chart. That just shocks me. That shocks me. No, it really does.
No, I can see that, because I mean, especially with how big Agents of Fortune had been, and I mean, especially Spectres. I mean, there's a lot of songs on there that sound like they should have been huge singles in that time frame when they came out, like what, 77 or something like that.
Makes me wonder if you never knew. I don't know how much is written about in that book, because I haven't read that book yet. But I almost wonder if what was going on behind the scenes, because songs in particularly in the 70s were going to be hits or not hits based on how much payola was going to be forked out for them. You know what I mean? You hear so many great songs from 60s, 70s, 80s, and you're just like, why wasn't this a hit? This is such a great song. It's like one of the greatest songs I've ever heard. Well, the answer is that people weren't getting paid enough. There's a great book called Hitmen. And did you read the book Hitmen? Hitmen is sort of it's a great expose of the record industry and the payola system. And how, like, for instance, REO Speedwagon got a lot of airplay because somebody gave somebody else a Rolex and all this kind of stuff. I mean, so I think what happened with Spectres. Oh, and it's also released late in 77. So I'm wondering if there was some sort of whiff of Some of Sin-ism. You wonder, like, what exactly was going on that isn't being reported on, wasn't being talked about. But I think that the fact that, you had Spectres where you had like what seemed to be two surefire hits on it, not getting any airplay at all, basically, except for on album rock stations. You really do have to wonder what exactly is going on, and what the you know, what's bubbling below the surface. And maybe Pearlman was seen as somebody who's going to tell tales out of school. I mean, maybe that the whole process sort of hints that he's putting on the cover of Secret Treaties and the back cover, caught up with him. And maybe it's like, well, this guy's got a big mouth, and we don't want him making any money. I don't know. It's
Yeah,
really,
I mean, it is, it's very odd. And I mean, especially because I think that was actually the first album, if I'm not mistaken, that there wasn't a Pearlman song on it that he had written. I think they had actually recorded the original version of In Another World. One of the songs from the Imaginos cycle was like a demo, but it didn't end up making it on the album. And it's like, yeah, BOC basically had distanced themselves from Pearlman. They had, kind of written just an album of these big, dumb rock songs, or even honestly, some more pop stuff. I mean, Death Valley Nights, for instance, really could have been a big pop hit as well. So, I mean, it just seemingly.
but a lot of Agents of Fortune's very pop too, though. I mean, don't forget.
Yeah, absolutely. But I mean, really the only real traces of the old weirdness on that though are the one kind of epic song, The Golden Age of Leather, and maybe the Kozer. But I mean, that's pretty much it. I mean, basically they really went away from the whole S&M biker thing, and there's really none of the conspiratorial or occult stuff or anything in there. It's just basically rock songs about, screwing groupies and doing coke and, Godzilla and, that type of thing. I mean, and even then, it just kind of like you're saying, it seems like Columbia just wasn't really willing to pony up the money to make it as big of a hit as it could be, even though seemingly they had a lot of songs on that album that really could have been big top 40 singles. It is a very, very strange situation.
Well, again, there are so many undercurrents here to pull apart, and we might not just have the information, because a lot of these things might have to do with discussions and arrangements being made that we just don't have any access to.
Yeah.
I do think it's interesting that they sort of hooked up with Michael Moorcock.
Yes, the great fantasy sci-fi writer. Yeah. He also did some. Go
ahead.
I was going to say he also did some lyrics too for Hawkwind, which I always thought was kind of interesting, because in some ways Hawkwind's kind of the British BOC in a sense.
Oh, very much, yeah. And don't forget Lemmy from Motorhead.
Oh yeah, you got the Lemmy connection too. Yeah, absolutely.
And but I don't think they really had a hit until Burning for You, which is 81. So there's a 5-year span between Don't Fear the Reaper and Burning for You. I mean, that's particularly back then.
Godzilla was a pretty big hit. Not as big as Don't Fear the Reaper, but I think that one was at least like a top 40 single. But yeah, I get what you're saying.
No, Godzilla didn't chart. I mean, it was probably big. Yeah, it was probably big on album rock stations.
Oh, wow. Okay. I did not. Yeah, I had always just. Wow. Okay. So yeah, that is really weird. Like you're saying, that was like an eternity between kind of hit singles then between Reaper and Burning for You.
It's crazy.
Yeah.
So it really makes you wonder. I mean, again, but it's interesting too, because they're doing the Black and Blue tour. I guess that's 1980, right?
Yeah.
So they were pretty. They didn't have any hit songs on the radio, but they were still a big draw live. I'm not exactly sure. I mean, a lot of people at the time said, you had Black Sabbath and Oyster Cult, who were both sort of had seen better days. They're sort of on the end of their string there, and this package tour is just being put together to kind of bring in, their respective audiences, and sort of like the old 50s package tours. But it really makes you wonder, because I mean, I remember what rock radio was like at that time. And, this is the, just before the playlist started to get, done by computers. 1980 was really sort of the start of that, when you had all these radio consultants and focus groups and computer algorithms and all these kind of things that were basically boiling everything down to like 40 or 50 songs. It was still a little more open and a little bit more wild and woolly as far as the stuff that would get on the air. So I think they were probably doing well in that regard. But, don't forget, in the late 70s and early 80s, I mean, FM radio is still considered a niche thing. In the late 70s, AM radio was where the top 40, all the top 40 radio was. I mean, I don't think there was any top 40 radio on FM until at least the early 80s. So, it's just a different world back then.
Yeah. I was going to say, I mean, I know they did do Cultosaurus erectus in 1980, which obviously that didn't really have any big singles on it, but my understanding is that was a bit of a fan favorite, and I think it did like well in the album format in AM radio, if I'm not mistaken. I mean, it did have some of the kind of, Marshall Plan and other tracks from the latter period that would be revered somewhat.
Yeah, well, that's where they did the collaboration with Moorcock.
Yeah.
But also a guy named Richard Meltzer, who had sort of been, I guess, moving in the same circles, at least as far as with Pearlman, like Crawdaddy magazine.
Yeah, they both worked at Crawdaddy, back in the day.
Yeah, just sort of like, not exactly fringe, but, I know that Meltzer had sort of moved into sort of the punk rock sphere in the later 70s, and but it's just interesting, getting back to this whole thing with Oyster Cult. And I really recommend that, anybody listening to this, if you just go back and listen to their earlier concerts, 72, 73, 74, it really is like proto speed metal. It's like they were a proto thrash band. And the first issue of Punk magazine, which was the first big punk fanzine, had an article on Oyster Cult. So there was still like, they weren't necessarily seen as, the enemy of punk rock. They were sort of seen, I don't know, necessarily say fellow travelers, but things weren't as, rigorous and ideological as they would become in the later 70s. There was still this froth, like AC/DC was sort of mixed in with like a lot of the punk stuff. I mean, it was just like loud, fast, whatever was annoying and sort of raw and ragged would be sort of, appreciated by sort of the same overlapping Venn diagram fan bases of like new wave of British heavy metal, proto-punk, late punk, and so on and so forth. And it's interesting to me that, the Oyster Cult were very much part of that. We're very much part of this whole scene. We're very much part of this like very hippie, post-hippie, edgy, bohemian, occultic, very dark and nefarious kind of subculture. And then by the time again of the Black and Blue tour, they're just seen as like this, cock rock band, and Alan Lanier's coming out on stage on the motorcycle and stuff. That was a friggin' cheesy move. That was a pretty. I think that kind of. No, I'm sorry, Eric Bloom, not Lanier. Eric Bloom would come out during the Black and Blue tour on a motorcycle, and it was very, very Spinal Tap. It was very Spinal Tap, and I think when they're not working with Pearlman and they're sort of playing with a lot of the same fantasy and sci-fi and occult themes, but didn't have like that sort of driving intellectual force behind it, then things I think got very Spinal Tap. With them, and it wouldn't surprise. What's that song by Spinal Tap that sounds like Godzilla? Do you know which one I'm talking about?
No, not off the top of my head, but yes, no, I could definitely see. I mean, I kind of feel like the Spinal Tap really might have even been inspired by the Black and Blue tour, because I know Sabbath has been cited a lot as an inspiration, but BOC.
Yeah, the Stonehenge thing was definitely inspired.
Yeah.
But I think Spinal Tap. Specifically were inspired by Status Quo. And Status Quo is a band that sort of started off as like like they would be playing with bands like Pink Floyd and that genre, that sort of poppy psychedelia thing. They had a song called "Pictures of Matchstick Men" that was a
Oh
hit,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
and then they morphed into sort of like this hairy kind of cock rock band, and I think that Spinal Tap was very much specifically modeled off Status Quo, because there's a scene when they're the psych band and like whatever happened.
Yeah, like in the
Guys.
late '60s, and yeah, yeah.
Yeah, Status Quo were very big in the UK and in Europe, but they never really made it here. So if they did play here, they would probably play a lot of the same kind of dumpy, half-empty places that you see in the Spinal Tap movie. But they were taking something from everything. Spinal Tap is really sort of a lot of anecdotes and rumors that had been milling around, the rock circles for a long time, and all just put into the same movie. I mean, I just think that's one of the greatest movies ever made, and certainly one of the greatest movies made about rock and roll.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, a true classic. But yeah, I mean, it's definitely though sad to see that. I mean, BOC really had fallen to that level, and I mean, they still are largely seen as a parody. And I mean, especially in light of how there's been a really a major rediscovery of a band from the same era like Black Sabbath in recent years, and then really just the entire kind of stoner metal doom genre, that type of thing that's so big with the kids now. I mean, just so much of that stuff was just really lifted wholesale from Blue Oyster Cult, to say nothing of as we've already been getting into, I mean, the extensive influence that they had on punk, on new wave, and all this other stuff. And they're still really the forgotten man. I mean, I mean, you have bands that people have never even heard of or conceived of existing, like Leaf Hound suddenly being hailed as pioneers, and just nobody even wants to talk about BOC. And I mean, certainly even in our kind of circles, the synchromystical stuff and what have you, I mean, nobody just seems to recognize just how cutting edge a lot of this stuff was that Pearlman was getting into in the 60s and the 70s, before a lot of this stuff even really started to get a lot of play until like the 90s, the early zeros, and what have you. I mean, they were just trailblazers on so many levels, and it is incredibly unfortunate that to this day they are just not given the appreciation by any number of groups that they should.
Well, it's interesting because I have this thesis, and there are people who sort of agree with me, even though they have their own spins on it. But I have a thesis that like a rock and roll band's true lifestyle is high school. So a certain cohort will come up and notice a band, sort of latch onto a band in either in eighth grade or in ninth grade, freshman year in high school, and be huge fans of them all throughout high school. And then when they get to college, they just sort of drop them. And I think that's what happened with Oyster Cult, is that they really hit the public consciousness around 75, 76. And then, it really drops off in the early 80s, even though they have that hit with, a very sort of atypical hit with Burning for You, and then the novelty hit with Joan Crawford. But, it's interesting because, when you talk about bands that were huge and then just sort of vanished and are now forgotten, I mean, Grand Funk Railroad. I mean, everybody knows American Band, which I consider the greatest rock and roll 45 of all time. But they were not a great band. I mean, that's a great single. It's one of the greatest recordings ever. But they were a pretty crap band, and people just tended to forget them. A band that, conversely, a band that I thought was great, Jefferson Airplane, they sort of morphed into the Jefferson Starship, which just became basically a cliche. It became like when you talk about bands that just long outlived their usefulness and just never seem to go away and just suck worse and worse. And Jefferson Starship really became that, because you had they had sort of a lot of soft rock hits in the mid to late 70s, and then they sort of morphed into a hard rock, arena rock band with stuff like Jane and Find Your Way Back. I mean, those are all pretty decent singles, but then it becomes We Built the City, and it's just like, oh, please go away, just bands that long outlive their usefulness. And unfortunately, because Jefferson Starship they just left such a stink, people don't go back and listen to the Airplane. unfortunately, the production values on a lot of the airplane stuff was rather poor, and a lot of that stuff is hard to listen to. But they were a great band, and they were a great live band. I mean, they were very much like the Dead. I mean, they were very much a jam band. But again, they just never seemed to escape the time period. There were just a lot of groups that are hugely popular and are now forgotten, and it's unfortunate, but it's just the way the industry works. And there are a lot of groups that nobody remembers and nobody heard of and nobody cared about that are just seen as immortals. I mean, so many songs that
The Velvet
people,
Underground.
yeah, like the Velvet Underground. I mean, literally nobody cared about the Velvet Underground. There was a whole cliche is like nobody saw the Velvet Underground, but everyone who did went out and started a band, So they
Yeah.
had a huge influence on other bands, but I mean, they didn't sell anything. I don't think they even made the top 200 with any of their records. I think maybe Sweet Jane and Rock and Roll sort of, they got some airplay and they might have gotten a little bit of sales, but nobody cared about that stuff. I mean, there's a lot of groups like that, just nobody cared about, but the people who did care about them cared about them a lot and kept the flame burning. And unfortunately for Oyster Cult, they just never attracted that core that would really latch on to them and sort of keep the flame burning past the due date. And again, I mean, they did a lot of cheesy stuff, and they sort of let themselves. I mean, I was watching, and this was a while ago. It might have been 10 years ago. They were playing up in Sturgis, and that big biker rally up there, and it was sad. It was grim. It was just like I think it's only Bloom and Buck Dharma left now.
Yeah,
I got the
basically.
original core of the band, and it was just bad. It was just like old men going through the motions, and I hate to say that, because we all get old. It happens to the best of us, but it's sometimes it's just time to hang it up. It just is.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, it's a sad thing to say, but nothing lasts forever, and nothing is less likely to last forever than pop culture.
Absolutely. But who knows? I do kind of think in the way things are going, we may be looking back still in some of those black and white albums and maybe 20, 50 years or something, and kind of seeing that Pearlman was onto something with his vision of the modern world and so forth. So yeah.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Oh, go ahead. No, you go ahead.
I got to take a quick break.
Oh yeah, I was actually going to say, but on that note, let's you want to wrap things up for now because
No, just let me take a break. I'll be right back, and then we can wrap.
Okay.
Amen.
All right. You all set?
Yeah, I'm good.
All right. Well, Chris, thanks again for joining me here. It was definitely fun to have this chat about BOC, and hopefully this will encourage some people to go out and check out some more of their work. As definitely those early albums up through Agents of Fortunes, and even Spectres to some extent are just fabulous. And more to the point, you're catching one of the most unique takes, I would say, on the secret history of the modern world. That Pearlman sort of weaves in some of the songs, and certainly getting into the Imaginos album. And finally, you've got some potentially very juicy limited hangouts that he was doing with all the stuff with the process and what have you. So yeah, it's intriguing. And, again, I hope that this will encourage some people to check out this criminally underappreciated band. Did you have any closing thoughts, Chris?
Yeah, I mean, not just the band. I mean, Sandy Pearlman himself is
Yeah.
screaming out for a comprehensive biography, a very, very interesting and very, very strange man who had, who was brilliant, had great technical ability, had an astonishing imagination, and was very much interested and inspired by the topics that you and I blog about. So, I know that back when he had died, I had written a sort of a eulogy for him, and then you did that great, what was it, a 3-part series?
5-part series, actually.
5-part series. You did that 5-part series that really expanded on that, and that was just a terrific reading. And I hope that you will link to that in the description for this, because I really think that people really need to check out Stephen's 5-part series on this. It will be ironically enlightening and entertaining read.
Absolutely. And certainly, yeah, it would be wonderful at some point if we could get a really comprehensive biography of Pearlman. In all honesty, I think we're only just scratching the surface. And yeah, it would be nice to maybe get some of his old cronies to go on record before they also descend to the stars, so to speak. Because,
Yeah, time is running out on that, unfortunately.
yeah, I'm sure there's a hell of a story there still to be told. Well, Frank will be back with us next week, and we have got an insane Hellier show planned for you guys. And hopefully, Chris and I will be doing another show here in the coming future. We got quite an impressive one planned out. We're going to go into the Sovereign Order of St. John. We're going to go into the Order of the Solar Temple, and maybe some other crazy fascist secret society type things. Anyway, thank you again so much for joining me, Chris. And to everybody else, thank you for listening. And yeah. Let's hopefully do this again sometime.